one thing I wanted to touch base on with the eligibility spectrum is, again, remember I said child welfare is has the premise of being neutral. But as I've stated, depending on the individual who's heard the information, depending on their social location, the neutrality seems to disappear, right? If you're someone who identifies with the population which is being served, there's not as much neutrality because you have an understanding of you have a better understanding of the population. If you're someone who sits in a different position of power, you may not have any understanding of the population, but none of those things are absolute. And it's going to gauge the way in which you do the work. The same thing is said with the eligibility spectrum. If we get a phone call and it's reported that the child said, my mom's going to beat me. For children who are of African Canadian descent, the word beat could literally mean one hit on the hand. But the word beat in a Eurocentric culture, in a Eurocentric society, means like this child's going to be left like black and blue on the floor. Oh my God, someone's got to go. Versus if you say my mom's going to hit me if you tell her I was bad today at school, then it's like, oh, okay, well, let's just talk to mom about that, right? But when you use terms like lick and beat, it's like, oh my God, alarms. And is it the marginalized population's responsibility to change their language, or is it the powerful population's ability to understand what's going on? Yes, they should be asking the questions, because you've got to figure out. Because we've all said, all of us as kids have said, oh my God, my mom's going to beat me for this. Meanwhile, beat may not even mean physically being touched. It could just be being yelled at and cussed at for an extended period of time, right? But it's just like, oh my God, like it's the dread of that, I don't want to hear it, I know, I did something wrong, right? That's how we all thought of as kids. Or we start to get sneaky because if it was a form of physical discipline, but it's like one or two hits, it's just like, okay, what am I going to do so I don't get in trouble for this? Because I don't even like the way that feels, right? It's that kind of thinking that if we remember that as kids, then we start to ask more, like the individuals who are making the reports could share more, or the individuals who are taking the report could start to ask more questions. So that's a bias, right? Because if it's the child's being physically disciplined, if they're reporting a concern for physical or inappropriate physical discipline, oh, alarm bells, right? Depending on who's taking the phone call.
I mean, we don't even always say beat. Sometimes we say kill. My parents kill me. It doesn't mean that his parent is
going to kill you.
Going to kill you. But so that's something else.
And if it's an African Canadian child who says, oh my God, my parents are going to kill me, teachers are all up in arms, or the referral sources are all up in arms. If it's their counterpart who is not African Canadian who says that, oh, you know what, let's talk to mom and dad, or oh, you know what, well, I'll explain to mom and dad what's happened, or I'll explain to mom, or dad and dad what's happened, so, you know, they won't be as upset with you. There's more of a willingness to share understanding with a community that happens to not be the African Canadian community for some reason. But again, those communities are not being described in such aggressive language as we've talked about this morning. We're going to be moving on to case files. So we've talked about the Child, Youth and Family Services Act, and that is the legislation. It's what governs the organizations. There are 38 non-Indigenous mandated child welfare agencies in the province of Ontario. Okay? Ontario and Quebec are one of the only two, I believe there might be one more, but one of the only two agencies that are broken down into jurisdictions and governed, and provide service that way in a jurisdictional model. Other provinces across the country are run strictly from the government. So it doesn't matter, say, where you are in, say, British Columbia or PEI or Nova Scotia, it is one government agency that runs the entire province for when it comes to child welfare. In the province of Ontario and in the province of Quebec, I know for sure, every area has their own local Children's Aid Society, which has a board of directors and their community that they service, and their stakeholders and things of that nature. We've talked about the standards, and in the standards, we've talked about the tools that have been used, the safety assessment tool, the risk assessment tool, the strengths and needs assessment, and the reassessment tool. And then we've looked at the eligibility spectrum. That's where the coding comes from, which is what then starts us down the highway of child protection, for a family that we're working with. And as time has gone on and families become more complicated, you could be dealing with a family who's come from a war-torn country, so then you have to look at things like trauma, PTSD. You could be dealing with families that are coming from the West Indies under whatever circumstances they're coming from. Then there's issues of, say, reunification issues when mom or dad has come up, or the parents are not together and one parent has raised the children back home in the islands and then the other parent has lived up here. So it's time to go live up in wherever, up in Canada with your father or your mother, and that father or mother doesn't know this child, right? And then that's a whole different set of things because you have a father or a mother who is living their position in life as a parent, and you have a child who says, you don't know me and I don't know you and I don't plan on listening to what you say. That's where you get things then like reunification issues and breakdowns and abandonment and possibly supervision issues or inappropriate physical discipline because these two people don't know each other. Right? So then what's the service that needs to be put in place for them? So there's those parts that come in when you're looking at your eligibility spectrums and how complicated a family can be in terms of what are they facing. And then we have here the last section, which is our case files, which are the investigations, collateral checks, your safety and risk assessment, so how those tools then get used and determine the trajectory of a family's file while in the child welfare system. So we're actually going to start off with a case study. And so we're going to hand out this case study and what you need to know in this case study. And so for everybody in the room also, please ensure you take these with you. If you want copies for your work, you can email us and we will ensure that they are sent out. The easiest email to use right now would be cew@oacas.org. And if you put in your subject line like booklets wanted or something like that, or resources wanted, I know who to send that to so that your agencies can get these. Yes? CEW@OACAS. I'm going to back up the slides. Ooh, there's a lot. Lord. So there. Okay. So I'm going to read out the points of the case study. So what we have here is a 13-year-old girl of African descent is pregnant and shows up at the hospital. She is brought into the hospital by her school vice principal because she went into labor in the bathroom. Nurse and doctor and the vice principal are talking about the fact that she's 13 years old and will be calling the social worker, so like the hospital social worker. They say that the baby will be apprehended. She has hidden her pregnancy from her family and doesn't want them and doesn't know what to do. She says her dad will kill her. Her teachers say her parents were very, very strict. Previously, the child came to school with a mark on her back. Teacher calls CIS. CIS worker calls police once the mark is reported. She has 2 other siblings at school. Secondary worker shows up at the school to intervene with the kids without the parents' permission. And the decision is made that this new mom and baby and the other children should be apprehended from home. So that's our case study. So I'm going to be asking you guys questions, and you're going to talk about them in your groups, okay? So, because one of the things we've talked to, some people have mentioned here is around the intersystems pieces, and how, like my sister over here said, around the silos in which all systems interact with not just child welfare in the different parts of the agency. So for one, when you think about intersystems, what are the systems that are now in place through this case study? So what are the intersystems pieces that are in place now with this case study? Yes. No, the child welfare worker. Okay. You're missing one more. Yes. So we created a case study and we said we're going to throw everybody in the pot. So we've got the healthcare system, the child welfare system, the police system, and the educational system. All 4. Okay? Oh, goodness. I can't knock on these things. So why? So why do you think the nurse, doctor, and the vice principal would make this decision? So that's one question. Yes?
I'm gonna throw this in there, the piece that the parents didn't know she was even pregnant, might make them feel as though the parents are negligent, and also the part where the teacher was like, they're very, very strict, they might translate that to they're negligent and abusive, and so there's no room for this child, nor their siblings, or the new child that's born. I'm just
Also, the piece that the child was previously had a mark.
Yep. Yep. Oh, they could be thinking that too. We didn't even think of that when we came up with the study, but yeah, that could be a piece too. That there could have been incest. That's why this 13-year-old's pregnant. Yeah, we didn't even think about that when we came up with the case study. But yeah, that is definitely something that could be taking place here too. So we've got here that we have a 13-year-old child, pregnant. Parents don't know. So what assumptions does that give? Then we have that this is a child who states she's been harmed by one of her parents. Or sorry, states she's been harmed because we didn't say if it was by one of her parents. We showed up with a mark. Says her parents are going to kill her. Okay. There's other children in the home. So do we see how the police became involved? Did I hear no?
Is this a current mark or a historical mark?
She previously came to school with a mark. Yeah. Yeah. So do we understand? Pardon me? The police were called because there's an allegation that the child's had a previous mark that the school has seen. Yes. Yes.
Could it be that the police even know who the potential father is?
That's also a possibility. That's a possibility as well, because what's the age of consent in the province of Ontario? And how old is this child? That can be a problem.
In our jurisdiction, if this happened in our school, we personally, the school wouldn't be calling the police because she's 13. We would be calling the CAS.
So yeah, it could be that the hospital's called CAS, the hospital called police or CAS called the police, and I believe that we wrote in here, CAS worker calls police once the mark is reported.
So they agreed to believe it wasn't the father.
Okay. So now this big decision's been made that these children are apprehended. Mom, baby, and mom's other two siblings. So do you know who I'm meaning when I say mom? Who do I mean? Yes. Yes. So we have the 13-year-old, an infant, and two other siblings who are apprehended.
from the 13-year-old's parents.
Yes. Okay. So now when you have when you have an example like this as a case study, you're thinking, first of all, wow, because that's a lot going on for one family. That's a lot going on. We decided we're just going to throw everything in there, right? Because it's a one-day training, we're going to throw in everything. Okay. So there's that piece. And then two, we wanted to be able to show how the systems end up working together but still not with the family, right? And so what we have here is now, so teachers told the VP's taking the child to the school, to the hospital's been involved. And so, does anybody understand why there's a secondary worker now? If someone said yes, yell out the answer as to why. So why is there a secondary child welfare worker involved?
Because of the children in the school.
Yes, yes. So you have one CAS worker who's at the hospital with a 13-year-old who's about to become a mother, but then we have information that she's been harmed, so we need to know, are the other two kids all right? But that first worker can't leave the hospital, so you got to get another one to go out to see these other two kids wherever they are. Under mandate. Just everybody's under mandate, which means everybody's under the age of 18. I was waiting waiting for somebody to ask that question. I've been waiting for somebody to ask that. The question was, how come nobody's called the parents? And I've been waiting for someone to ask that question. Yes.
Everybody would say, my parents are going to kill me.
Yes. Yes. But when you look at things through a system that was not created for you, and you look at it through an anti-Black lens, and you hear statements that we talked about that peak alert in systems like, my parents are going to kill me, I haven't told my parents I'm pregnant, the systems aren't going to know how Mr. and Mrs. are going to walk through the door. They have no clue who's coming through the door. So, and on top of that, you have a VP that says this child had a mark on them previously. We don't know what previously could have been. It could have been a week ago, 2 weeks ago. Which means someone who's pregnant, although no one knew she was pregnant, has been harmed. That doesn't excuse. But did that have any more physical impact on her? Yes, my sister in the back.
But there was no connection. It's like trying to find out if the cop had to do with the pregnant.
We don't know, right? But if this is what's presented to a worker at face value, and they start to look around, this is something that can happen. Yes, my sister.
The teacher, I was waiting for you to be with the teacher, the VP, and the hospital to some extent, all decided that they were going to be trying to find the entire family, including the parents, right? So they were the parents of the parents, and they're making decision on behalf of this entire family unit, as if this unit do not have elder or head of household, right? So they've taken that role as traditionally you go through the system. Everybody wants to parent you, whether you want to be parent or not.
Exactly. So we have a child who's 13, says she's pregnant, says her parents are going to kill her. So we don't know who's walking through this door at the hospital once these parents have been contacted to say, hi, Grandma and Grandpa. We then have a child who's had a mark. There's 2 other siblings. Keeping in mind, we don't know who gave the child the mark. We don't know that. We don't know who gave the child the mark, right? But somehow a decision's been made. Everybody is not going home.
There is all secrets that stereotyping that the parents are seen as a matter of fact, maybe they are, they're part of the problem because for one thing, the child is in the home, the child is 13, why would a parent not know that the child is pregnant? So there could be a lot of stereotyping that is going on. There is a doctor, there might be certain questions that are asked that are not asked of the parents, the black parent.
Okay. So let me ask you guys this question. Let's say one of these 2 parents is someone that's highly regarded in the community. Whether they are some type of a counselor, whether they're some type of, say, a pastor, or whether they are some type of an elder, or someone who's highly regarded in the community. Do you think that would have an impact on the decision made for these children? No. Why not? Thank you. So, do you think anything was left out in everything about this case study? Okay, I saw some hands go up, so I got my sister over here. Oh, that's right. So her voice is being left out. My friend up here.
Immigration. I think immigration
Ooh.
plays a big important role.
Yes.
Yeah, especially for child protection workers, who
Yes.
I assume are people who have done degrees, and they have done like studies to like they have done like the developmental stages. They have done like the 8 stages of development by Erickson. We do understand that racialized kids struggle because most of them, like maybe let me say 6 to 12 years who come here, they're struggling with like inferiority, trying to measure up to the peers around them. And if they realize that I can't measure up with sports, I can't measure up with academics, just because they're starting from scratch, that affects them, and that affects their behavior, and that affects the home environment. On top of that, parents as well are experiencing poverty for the first time because where they were coming from, like in their previous countries, they had the good jobs, they had good homes, and they're experiencing poverty for the first time, they're experiencing using the system for the first time. So all these things taken into consideration, they affect the kids, they affect the parents, because parents don't know how to deal with the kids. They're just thinking that I brought you to a good country and you are not appreciating it. In the meanwhile, the kids have to struggle with bullying at school. People have to ask them, talk to them about their hairstyle, which they don't see anything wrong with it. They have to talk to them about their accent, which they don't see anything wrong with it. So it is a lot. So I'm just surprised that all these things are not taking into consideration that immigration plays a huge role in kids' behaviors and parents and family and all those things.
Mm-hmm. My friend here in the back. You.
Oh, I was gonna say voice of the child, it's just like there's no, everything has been done and yet we didn't even ask the 13-year-old, like, who's the father? What was the relationship like with that person?
So, like my sister said over here, I hope you guys can hear me. A lot of people like this whole situation's being parented, or everybody's talking about the family, around the family, and not with the family, right? So that's where we've now lost the child's voice. That's where nobody's bothered to check in with the parents, even though we know now that mom or dad are someone, say, important within the community. No one's done any of that. Because again, they're following the legislation, they're following the standards, the tools in terms of child protection. But as my sister so eloquently said here, there's other factors that could be affecting this family that no one's taken into consideration that can fall under the lens that is not the Eurocentric North American value system, okay? So I'm gonna ask you guys questions. So what right does Children's Aid have to interview the kids at the school? Thank you. Say that nice and loud.
Child and Family Services Act.
So because there's a concern that one child has been harmed previously in something like this, a CAS worker can go and speak to the children and then tell the parents afterwards. Now, a lot of child welfare agencies are trying to change that practice and try to find a way to work better with the family and schedule a time. But when you have a concern where a child has had a mark and someone who is in a position of power, i.e. the school in this situation, has seen it, they're going to go and talk to children at school without the parents being told. Yes?
Is there a protocol or a procedure in place with regards to their ability to determine, like, for example, that mark on the back, it being something worthy of further investigation, or it just simply being a mark in the back? For example, I've woken up in the morning and seen a mark on my back. I don't know how I scratched myself in the middle of the night and did it. So at what point, seeing that, do they evaluate it? How do they evaluate that, and what determinations are in place for us, even as parents, to say, yeah, you followed the protocol. Your determination was not based on bias, your personal experience, your opinion, the news report you saw last night. None of that. It's actually based on some specific things that we could all agree on, determines whether or not that scratch is abuse related or a scratch from the park. And again, yes, when the voices aren't being heard on all parties to make a conclusive decision on what level we're at in the eligibility spectrum and so forth, what are the consequences, what are the supports in place for parents to now turn to? I'm talking realistic now. Now turn to when your voice was not heard, your child's voice is not being heard, your child is writing letters to the judge, and you guys are speaking clear English. Everyone else in your world knows you, but it's what's on the paper and what the judge and what the people in authority and have rights to say, only that's being said. So I know that's kind of probably a little bit of two things in one, but I basically want to know the determining factors. I'm going to just summarize and break it back.
So if a child, so again in this, we don't know if this child's reported to their school, whoever gave them the mark. Okay? We don't know that. So if we have a child who shows up at school and they have a mark and they've stated, so-and-so did this to me and this is what they did it with, and then the teacher's seen the mark or someone's seen the mark, there's a very clear-cut set of protocols in terms of how it gets reported and who gets called first. So if you have a child who shows up at school who has a mark, it's a certain amount of, say it's about 2 inches wide, and it's a long mark, and they state they got hit with a belt, and the teacher looks at the mark and can say it's about 2 inches wide, about 6 inches long. It's about like this, so it depends on maybe how hard or how long what part of the belt hit them. CS is being called, and CS is going to turn around and call police. Okay? If it's a child who has a mark and they're nonverbal or they cannot explain who did it, the CAS would talk to the school and go and see the child first, take a look at the mark. Okay? If it's a mark if it's not a mark but some type of an injury, so you say have a child with a limb that's not moving the way it was, that's when, say, the hospital can get involved. And it's not any hospital, it's a specific hospital, which is the Hospital for Sick Children, which has a department called SCAN, which stands for Suspected Child Abuse and Neglect. They are the ones who then will look at the child, possibly x-ray and whatever other scans they need to do to be able to comment on the type of mark it is. They are the ones who are able to then verify or not verify, so either back up the parent's story or completely be opposed to the parent's story of how the child would have gotten, say, the mark or. Yes.
I'm curious, at what point will the scan be involved? At this point, the parents being informed?
If the parents are definitely being informed, if SCAN has to be called, because more than likely, police has been called. You're generally not going to, like, if SCAN's involved, police are involved, child welfare is involved, the parents have been called because the parents need to come down to the hospital. Okay? Yes.
See, the school social worker, I have a whole lot of trouble with a whole lot of this, right?
Okay.
I need to have a whole bunch of questions answered before I'm gonna say that it's okay to say that the CAS, which is coming to interview the 2 other kids, are they there to interview the 2 other kids because the 13-year-old sister is pregnant? Is that the reason?
No, because the 13-year-old had a mark.
Oh, but I thought that was in the past, so it says previously
Mhm.
the child had a mark.
But she's
So-
had a mark and stated that her dad's gonna kill her.
Yeah, so when they came and they did the investigation, then they spoke to the child, to the other children. Okay, that makes sense.
But as the school social worker, you don't have the authority to state, I have a problem with you doing this, you
No.
can't.
But it's not clear to me, so
Mhm.
the 2 things are separate to me.
Mhm.
If the reason they're going to the school to interview the 2 kids is because your sister is pregnant, I don't know how that, I don't understand that.
Mhm.
If they're going to the school to look at the report that they got from the school about the mark, that's different. So now we can have, as far as I'm concerned, that says you can talk to all 15 of the kids, how many other children they have. But when I read that, it sounded like that was a past event
Mhm.
that they had investigated. And now she's pregnant, and now they have made a decision that something bad's going on with her because she's pregnant, and that puts her other siblings at risk.
And that's where we get all of our questions. Yes. So the next question is, when do police get involved? But does everybody have an understanding from what we've talked about as to how the police can get involved? Yes.
Clarify, what space is there that CAS workers can say yes or no to calling police? Like, do they absolutely have to call police every single time, or what are, like?
So you remember when I showed the eligibility spectrum, and there was that first section that was like a darker gray coloring? Police have to be called at that step. Yes, because it's severe and it's the right now. Okay. Yes.
The decision of all the different practitioners not to call parents, does that follow under any protocol, or was that like within their power?
That's the decision they made, because that's prior to them, like that's prior to CAS getting involved in this, like with this case. So they're the ones, once they've had a duty to report, they can quote unquote wash their hands of it, as some will say, and it's then up to child welfare to start dictating and leading how things will go. But because child welfare is trying to change and looking at strength-based, they're looking at trying to have everybody's voice involved so that the best decisions and outcomes can be made. So here's my next question. What happens if children are placed in care? What happens if children are placed in care? Yes?
They have I don't know the word for it, but like a trial within 24 hours?
So CAS has to go to court within 5 days, so that's probably what you're thinking of. So that's one thing that happens. The CAS has to go to court within 5 days and explain themselves to a judge. But what happens if a child's placed in care? What else happens?
Well, the possibility exists that they may not all be together.
Yes. So depending on availability in a foster home, depending on age of children, depending on any type of behavioral needs, if there's special needs for any of the children, that would then dictate where a child could be placed. And in some situations, depending on how many siblings it is, siblings can be unfortunately broken. Being broken up.
Parents, trauma.
Yeah.
I was gonna say, I was looking at some things can happen different phases of something else, but almost every time I go see trauma.
Yeah.
Every time.
Every time.
Child can move from the home. So if they're experiencing some type of trauma in the home, guarantees it's gonna be an addition, or it doesn't matter. I mean, a balance out where you've got rid of that one, but not.
A different type of trauma took its place. Yep.
That
Yep.
also happens.
Mm-hmm. What rights do, when I say I'm talking the family or the parents, have to disagree with a CAS handling a case? So what rights do a family have in the way CAS handles their case and their way of disagreeing with it? So name some of them. Yep. What are you going to do at court? What are they going to do at court? So that means getting a lawyer. So on your first appearance, you may not be able to have a lawyer at that point in time. It means speaking to duty counsel to start getting your voice heard. And it's going to mean finding a lawyer afterwards. It means if you cannot afford a lawyer, legal aid, and being able to speak to someone who's going to help you able to represent your family's best interests and tell your side of the story. Yes?
Just to clarify, you said that parents don't have the right to have someone represent them on the first visit?
No, they do. No, they do. No, very clearly. Parents have the right at every step of the way to have representation, give legal advice, they do. What ends up happening though, sometimes on the first appearance, because it's within 5 days, it might be hard for them to get a lawyer. So at least if they've come to court, speak to the duty counsel who will represent you on the first appearance, and then from there, start looking into the legal aid process if they cannot afford a lawyer. If they can, get a lawyer who's well versed in family law. Well, They do. They do. So something else in this file. So we now have a 13-year-old who's a mom who's been apprehended. So she's in one file as the child of concern, and she's in another file as a parent. She has a lawyer through the Office of the Children's Lawyer for both her files.
She automatically gets a lawyer?
Automatically gets a lawyer because she's over the age of 12.
But could not also the parents request a lawyer for the other kids?
The lawyers, yes, parents can request a lawyer for children who are under the age of 12, but automatically at the age of 12, a lawyer from the Office of the Children's Lawyer is assigned to a child. Okay.
Yes.
What is expected of the caregiver? Someone mentioned something about not knowing she was already pregnant. So what's expected of these caregivers?
You should know all aspects of it.
You should. You would think they would. You would have an idea of what's going on.
But she's a teen.
Yes. Haha. She's an adolescent.
She's gonna hide it.
Who's the best at hiding things from their parents? Teenagers. Yes.
A teenager who's been taught to have rights,
Yes.
as you know what I mean, have rights.
Yep. Teenagers who have been taught their rights. Yes.
At what point would CES request a parenting capacity assessment of the child's parents?
So if say now our grandma and grandpa, that would be further down the line. You'd have to look at parenting capacity assessments are usually assigned when there's some concern around mental health.
Okay, so, but we don't know this family's previous history with CAS. So there is the possibility that further down the road that the CAS worker may suggest a parenting capacity assessment of the parents,
Of grandma and grandpa?
possibly.
If.
Their history.
If.
If they had previous history.
Well, there needs to really be a concern in regards to mental health in terms of requesting a parenting capacity assessment. Not being able to like other factors come into play when it comes to a parenting capacity assessment, but it wouldn't just be because of, say, having these points in place. A lot of other things would have to be going on. A lot of things would have had to have been tried and not successful in order to start looking down that avenue. Okay. What are the rules around spanking? Yeah.
Once there is object use
Mm-hmm.
or markup.
Mm-hmm. Yes. Did everybody hear that? Okay. So when it comes to the rules around spanking, spanking can be done between the ages of 2 and 12 with an open hand, as long as there's no intent to leave a mark. When you pick up an object to assist in spanking, you now move yourself as a parent into the criminal code because you've now used an object, which is where assault with a weapon becomes a charge. Okay? And children's aid societies will not and do not promote using physical forms of discipline when it comes to child rearing or raising children. They will always look at other alternatives in order to redirect or change behaviors that do not use physical discipline.
And they train the parents?
Pardon me?
And they train the parents when they recommend these spaces come in? Do they first, or at some point, make an effort to maybe do workshops with the parents on?
They will talk to the parent. They will talk to the parents about other forms of discipline. If some form of a parenting course is needed, they will assist parents in trying to find one.
Right?
Yeah, they will. I know I have as a child protection worker. So our next question. When children are put up for permanent care. Yes.
I know like 9 times out of 10, the contact with parents is completely cut off.
Depending on what a judge will order. Some judges will order with access, some will order without. It could possibly be adoption, or it could be if it's crown wardship without adoption, but most times they are looking for crown wardship with adoption these days. Or sending to a family member, giving custody to a family member instead of the child growing up in the system. It's a very long process. Very long process. Yep. Yes. It can be a long process. It's not just going to be your kids are taken today and we're looking for a permanent seat tomorrow. There is a process. They set goals. They have service plans. And at the end of the day, the CYFSA states to the first thing in court is to return children back to the parent they were taken from. Okay? But it's when things have continually not been able to improve with that parent that the society has to start looking at alternative measures because they cannot allow for children to grow up in care. Children have grown up in care. We have a whole generation of people who have grown up in care. They are currently in their early mid-20s. They've grown up in care. It didn't go well for them. So society is like, okay, then what do we have to do? Because we can't do that again, it didn't work. What are other ways that we can start addressing some of these issues? And that's why kinship is such a large support used in the child welfare system. It's such a large resource because if they're not going to do great growing up in care, mom and dad are currently not the option. Are there other family members who can be the option? Because then you're going to be able to address all of the cultural components and all their cultural needs, possibly their religious needs, continuing on with their language, continuing on with their heritage. All those pieces can still stay in place. Plus, you've ensured the child's in a safe home where they still can then know who they are and where they come from. And then the last question is, what is the termination of parental rights?
That's when courts have made a decision that you no longer have the authority to make a decision where this child can be care or work or whatever.
Did everybody hear that answer? No? So what my sister said was, that is where a judge or the court of law has determined that the parent no longer has the rights over that child. This tends to be then where a child becomes a Crown ward. And then the society then looks at other options, whether that is adoption or whether that is legal custody through another adult that child may already know. So any one of these, the pieces of this case study that we've gone through, depending on who the worker is, this can go very, very wrong for a family, or there can be some challenges in place and things can develop. We don't know that these parents are not supportive parents, but they were very focused on education. The fact that their 13-year-old daughter is now pregnant, yes, they're gonna be disappointed, but we don't know that they're gonna accept that child, right? And want to take care of their grandchild along with their daughter and teach her how she needs to be a parent, put in maybe possibly a different set of rules because she now needs to understand you're responsible for somebody else. We don't know that maybe that mark was something not even caused by her parents. Maybe the mark was caused by the individual who got her pregnant. Right? There's so many pieces that can be determined and found out once the investigation starts. That's why it's called an investigation. The worker literally has to start figuring out what's going out piece by piece by piece. So that's just something we wanted to kind of take everybody through to say, these are different points that can come across in dealing in child welfare. Yes?
I think just looking at this case study, we have some thought that the decision would be one that was objective, information-based. So I think a lot of us would trust the decision was the best for all those individuals. Mm-hmm. So I think that's maybe another reason why we didn't have as much of a voice of what's going on, because there's some trust in the system, even though we know that that's not as good as it could be.
Yeah, that's another point. Everybody always trusts in the system. We know the system's flawed. We know parts of it are broken, but we still hold some level of trust in this system. All right? We always, but again, we hold trust in a system that wasn't created for us. We hold trust in a system that didn't have us in mind when they were putting themselves together. Right? And due to things like colonialization, we hold that trust. We've been taught to hold this trust in a system that stripped the African Canadian community of a lot of its identity. And we're still trying to build back pieces of that identity. So on top of the outward system that's around us that's told us this is how you're to be, this is how you're to act, and this is what you can follow, we have the inward pieces of our own system of being African Canadian that we still have to work through. Right? Yes?
On the issue of
Mm-hmm.
parents do not trust workers.
Mm-hmm.
So what they would tell us as an outsider
Is very different from what they'll tell the
very
worker.
different.
Mm-hmm.
And depending on the worker's race, they will tell them nothing.
Yep. Yep.
And so you have to do a little dance to get, to the root of things.
Mm-hmm.
But then, how much do we share with that worker? Right. Because if the worker is blind to what needs to be done, but sometimes it's not, because they don't understand.
Mm-hmm. It is a dilemma. But at the end of the day, if there is a legitimate concern for the child's safety, is that a risk any community agency wants to take in not sharing? Because if that concern turns out to be true, and that child is harmed, and a community agency worker had knowledge, that's not a set of shoes I'd ever want to stand in. The set of shoes I stand in as a child protection worker are extremely hard already, but I wouldn't want to stand in those shoes of knowing something and not sharing it. Okay? And we're going to get into something called duty to report when we look at teachers, and we look at our community-based agencies, and we look at our professionals that all have this duty to report. So if they hear of a concern that compromises the safety of a child, they have to say something. They have to call their local Children's Aid Society. And if you choose not to, and something else happens to that child, the police may be looking to speak to them in terms of negligence.
Can I add?
Yes, go right ahead.
So I think what we found with the project is that a lot of huge component around overrepresentation is due to duty to report, and the fact that it's like this liability that people are kind of saying, well, we think, I'm not sure, I'm gonna pass it on, and then the system does its thing. I think as a community agency, 100%, if there's a child at risk and you know that, you must tell, right? You must report. But you do so in the knowledge and understanding that you're reporting to a system that may not have the best interests of this Black family, right? So you go with your tools, with your race equity practice, with your knowledge, with all of that, right? With the Black community behind you, you go with that. But you still do your job and you do what you know you need to do to protect the child, but you go with this armed with the knowledge, right? That's, I think, fair.
Yes, you have to report that thing that may be a concern for the child, but then also make sure you speak about whatever strengths or what's great with this family. Because that's going to help to change the narrative that the worker's already going to start to think about. And that's going to help, that could possibly be something that helps change the trajectory for that family. Yes. Yeah.
When you're calling to report and talking to intake doesn't ask you questions, right? So because I called CAS, honestly, several times a week, all they ask me is for parents' information, the address, date of birth of the children, the parents, what schools they go to if I have that information as a landlord, and what my concerns are. So for the majority of the time, as a landlord, I'm hearing from community members who are saying, oh, this family, single mom with multiple children, we think the dad is living there illegally, which is a housing issue, not a CES issue. Domestic violence in the household, we hear the parents yelling and screaming, we can hear physical violence in the home. So I'm reporting verbatim what I'm hearing to CAS. It's not I can't investigate, that's CAS's job. But in intake though, they never ask what are the strengths of the family. It's just, what do you have? Give it, and then they send it off. Thank you very much. Click. Right? That's how it works.
So some CASs don't ask for strengths, some do. So if your area has a CAS that does not ask for strengths, volunteer the information. If they ask, is there anything else I need to know about this family? Yes. Tell them what these strengths are of this family. Because at the end of the day, that's only going to help the family. And that might actually lessen the amount of work the CAS worker has to do, right? At Toronto, they have 2 domestic violence teams that do investigations at their intakes investigation department. And at one point in time, they had violence against women's workers. And those violence against women's workers were able to work with the moms so that the intake worker, they didn't have to do all that work with the moms. They could help the mom with where to go for housing, where to go for daycare, explaining what the court process may look like, going with them to court. That freed up that intake worker's time, that investigation worker's time, to then go and find the individual who's been charged with the assault, right? But it's about knowing, so where are your strengths? For community-based agencies in the room, you know, with your child welfare, if you know you may have, say, a service or a project or something that may be helpful to child welfare, go to your child welfare agency and say, hey, this is our ABC service, this is what we provide, is there any room for collaboration? Because agencies are committed to decreasing the disparities in service, decreasing the disparities in service. So if there are services that are out there in the community, tell them to your child welfare agency. They may listen, they may not. But if they're committed, which they state that they are, and they want the diversity, they want to decrease their numbers, they want to improve services to family, they want the strong families living in the communities, tell them what you offer. Because it's very hard for one agency to go out and look for everything that's in the community. But if there's a community agency that says, hey, you know what? We know here living in Peel, there's a lot of reunification, and sometimes reunification doesn't go well. We have a reunification program, and we have evidence-based research that shows the program is working well. Go into Peel CAS and say, hey, we have a reunification program. Is it something you'd be interested in looking into in partnering with? Yes.
Is there a mechanism to report a worker, a CAS worker, who might be refusing number one to accept that, that you can make a complaint?
You would be then complaining to their supervisor? Not outside of the child welfare agency, unless you take it to the CFSRB.
Can you give us that information?
No, but what about
I don't know what their setup looks like in terms of their ombudsman since they've gotten rid of Pacey.
Okay, one of the things that One Vision, One Voice has always said is that there is nowhere for
To put the
families to
complaint.
That's why Judy and Shahira were hired, right, as CEWs, as community engagement workers, because Kika, when she was on her own, was getting all these calls from the community, complaints, you know, I'm caught up in the system, and there was nowhere for them to go, and there still isn't. So right now, until March 31st, there's Judy, right? But aside from that, and that's a point of advocacy for everyone in the room. And there used to be Pacey for youth, but that's gone, so.
You can share all this information with us, but if we don't have a place to take our concerns, it's really sort of redundant, because I think some workers need to be reported just based on the way they've treated families. And perhaps if they know that we have a mechanism to report them, they may be a little more, right, they may be sensitive to the way they treat families.
I mean, if they're a registered social worker, then you can register them, you can complain back to their college, right? But again, child protection workers don't necessarily need to be registered social workers. No, you do not.
And they're all these assessments, the eligibility spectrum assessments, they're not so flawed, the marks.
So an eligibility is not an assessment. The eligibility spectrum is not an assessment. It's just taking the referral, and it falls into somewhere on the scale that we showed. But using the risk assessment tool, the safety assessment tool, the strengths and needs assessment tool, it's answering questions of a document that was made it wasn't made by frontline workers. So they're just following the steps in the tool that they've been provided with to help make the decision.
Mental health specialists are experts in any way, shape, or form, but they can assess whether or not the parent, in their opinion, has a mental concern, as well as a whole bunch of other social factors. They can determine all of that and make a recommendation.
They can have a concern for mental health and then suggest that the parent or whoever should be involved with someone from the mental health system, but they themselves cannot say, yes, this individual has such and such mental health issue.
Yeah,